We are honored to have with us today one of the leading global customer experience expert, Peter Dorrington, the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Anthrolytics. Peter is the inventor of predictive behavior analytics and an expert in customer and employee experience management analytics. He will be sharing with us his deep knowledge and expertise in his keynote talk titled The Impact of Customer Empathy on the Bottom Line. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chrissa. I'm delighted to be with you all today. As Chrissa said, my name is Peter. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Anthrolytics. And what I want to do is share with you some of the insights from 8 years of thinking and researching and practicing, combining data science with behavioral science. So I'm trying to teach computers about why people do the strange things that they do. And today I'm going to focus on empathy and its impact on the bottom line. So firstly, what do we mean by empathy? Well, it fits into a continuum of when we feel pity for people. So I see somebody and I feel sorry for them, or I have sympathy with them. So I feel a range of emotions, not just sorrow, but empathy is when I feel some of what they're feeling. But ultimately, the real prize is compassion. So when, as a result of what I feel and how you feel, I take an action. Now, we sometimes describe this as walking in somebody else's shoes. Now, some people say, well, how does it compare with emotional intelligence? Well, empathy is part of emotional intelligence because there are other things you need as well, like the ability to regulate your emotions and being able to display appropriate emotions back to people. So they're not quite the same. And emotional intelligence is very much a human skill. But as more businesses have moved online, one of the things that they have found challenging is how do you stand out from everybody else in a digital world? Because we have to describe ourselves in ways that other people will recognize, that they can search for, or will appear on a comparison website. So we become commodities. And here is where empathy can be an enormous competitive advantage, because it isn't just doing what you do really well. We expect that. It's actually being able to form a relationship. So empathy in the digital world looks a little bit like this. 3 main components. I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The first of which is cognitive empathy. So understanding what somebody is feeling, what their emotions are, and ideally why they may be feeling those. There's emotional empathy, and that's where I feel what you feel. Remember, I said that's the important part about empathy. And then compassionate empathy, that's really where we take an appropriate action as a result of those feelings. Now, in the digital world, we leave emotional empathy to people. Computers don't feel emotions, but we can do a lot to identify what somebody might be feeling. So what are the emotions they're feeling? And then identify an appropriate action as a result of that. Now, human beings don't just feel things out of nowhere. There are drivers. There are things that trigger emotions. That's a word that's used a lot online at the moment. And the actions can take many forms, including not doing anything. But what we ultimately want to do is treat customers the way that they want to be treated themselves. So this is actually addressing their feelings rather than what we think they may need. So digital empathy focuses on understanding what people are feeling and then taking or selecting an appropriate action. Now, feelings aren't the only thing that come into mind when we're working with emotions. So here's a way that I have to think about how people make decisions, because it's the decisions that lead to the behavior that we observe. And I'll talk about expectation in just a second. So let's look at this diagram very quickly. Well, at the bottom, we've got what is it that they're trying to do, how, where, and so on. So it's the stimulus, that's the trigger to do it, and the context, which is the where, who, why, what, and so on. And then I want to take wants and needs next. So needs are the practical considerations. Those are the things that we tend to think about when we're making a decision. So what's the price? Would it do the job that I want it to do? Is it available and convenient to buy, and so on? Wants are the emotions associated with those, and we aren't typically aware of those, but they may be things like, well, I want to feel a little bit happier, or I want to be less afraid. Now, the difference between a need and a want is that needs can be satisfied. So if I'm hungry and I eat, I'm not hungry anymore. But I might want a nice juicy steak, and actually there's no limit to that. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how happy I feel. I could always believe I could feel happier. So needs and wants, we balance those two out. Then we've got, if you ever use star ratings to select something online, external influences. What does everybody else think? What is everybody else doing? And the biggest, most troubling area that we do when we deal with empathy is actually understanding how people got to where they are, their emotional journey. Now, the final point right at the top is the internal biases. And what I mean by this is the way that our brains let us down, because we rely on either rules of thumb that we've learned through experience, or we think we're being clever when actually we're not, and we're not as logical as we think we might be. So all of those things are a combination of the heart and the brain leading to decisions. But the bit I want to focus to is the emotions and how do we get to where we are today. And I'm going to describe that bit in a moment. But firstly, a lot of people ask me, how does this compare to something like Net Promoter Score? Or how does this affect customer satisfaction? Well, I just want to show you how those historical events lead into expectations. And expectation is what we compare an experience to. There is no universally agreed scale for customer experience or customer service. What we tend to do is measure it against what we expect. So here's a simple graph. We've got two axes. My expectation, low, it's a budget experience, or high, I expect to get premium experience. And across the bottom, what did I actually get? Was it a good customer experience, or was it a poor customer experience? And there are three zones here I just want to talk about. So let's start at the top left. Overpromise and underdeliver, where we set the expectation very high and then fail to deliver against it. Now, clearly that's going to be disappointing. At the bottom right, we've got the underpromise but overdeliver. So I wasn't expecting the great service that I received, and I think that's delightful. Now, the problem with both of those is they don't match what I was expecting, and therefore I will have a little bit of a subconscious feeling that perhaps I don't really understand this, or it's not predictable. The ideal is to be in the sweet spot, which is when we're anticipating what it is that the customer wants and we're able to deliver against that. So the sweet spot is also where you have the greatest cost efficiency. After all, if you overpromise and underdeliver, you're going to have a lot of complaints. You're going to have to do a lot of post-sale customer service. If you underpromise but overdeliver, you probably can't charge the full value of the experience you're delivering, and you may even be operating at a loss. So when we look at things like CSAT scores, NPS, or any other measure of satisfaction, I want you to bear in mind it's against what we experienced that we're measuring it, and our expectation, and a lot of that is emotional. So that's where this fits in within things like Net Promoter Score and so on. Now, I'll briefly talk about the emotions that I use. There is no perfect model for this, and this is Robert Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions. If you use a search engine and put in emotion analytics, I guarantee this will be at the top half of the results. And this diagram, let me briefly explain what it talks about. Here we've got 8 universal emotions that everybody on the planet feels. So these are the core emotions. So we've got joy and trust, or sadness and surprise, or fear or anger. And by combining those, so we don't just feel one, we feel combinations of these, we can come up with all the others. So if we combine joy and trust, we end up with love or liking. So we use this because, firstly, it's really quite straightforward, and there's an enormous amount of research about what went into this model and how it's used. And you'll also notice that each of those petals, at the center of the diagram, it's where we feel it really strongly, and at the outside, it's where we don't feel it quite so strongly. But we can also explain it. to other people, it's explainable. Now, I've seen people say, well, we've got 200 emotions in our model or 300 emotions. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I struggle with more than 8, especially if I'm looking at combinations of them. So a simple model, everybody on the planet feels these emotions to some degree. We tend to feel them simultaneously, and they do tend to reside in the background all of the time. So we're always feeling some degree of all of these. But also we can then share these with the people who are going to design experiences so that they can say, well, if somebody is, for example, anxious, they're afraid, then perhaps what I can do is design an experience which reassures them. So that's the emotions wheel, Plutchik's wheel of emotions. I say that it's at the core of the techniques I use, but there are others. And not all of these are as significant as others. There's about 5 major ones that really do play a lot in decision making. But I talked about the wants and the needs, and this is based upon a research paper I published last year. It's a multifaceted decision-making process. So let me talk you through this model, the boxes. Everybody's got a 4-box model, including me. So what we have is on the left-hand side, the practical or physiological needs, the things I actually need, and on the right are the psychological or emotional needs, how I want to feel. On the top layer, we've got what do I need for myself, which is completely independent of vendors. And on the bottom layer, it's what do I expect of the people I want to do business with. So let's take a couple of examples of these. So the psychological self needs is how do I want to feel? Remember I said, it doesn't matter how happy I am. I always think I could be a little bit happier, or I could be a little bit calmer or more confident about the future. We're not really aware of that, but that's what's going on. The practical needs, price, convenience. Is it affordable? Because it doesn't matter how much I love it. If I can't afford it, I'm not going to be able to buy it. And then at the bottom hand, how do we choose between vendors? So what are the characteristics that I'm looking for from the people I want to buy from? So there's, again, psychological and practical. Practical, what I call hygiene, would be, well, can I get to the store? Can I purchase it at all? Do they have it in stock? Or do they have it in the type or model that I want? And the values bit. Now, many organizations have identified the importance of stating your values and your purpose. So I want to buy from an organization that has values that align with mine. So it may be ethical purchasing or maybe compassionate purchasing. I don't want to go to somebody perhaps that doesn't serve me as a vegetarian or as a vegan. It may not be a practical decision, but it's certainly a psychological one. Now, I've given some examples to those. There's about 40 or so in the white paper. And if anybody wants it, then let me know. I'll send you a copy through from that. So combination of what do I want for myself in terms of wants and needs, and what do I expect from you also in terms of wants and needs, the emotions and the practical elements of that. So then let's moving on then. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting. When we're looking at the roles of emotions in decision making, one of the things that I have to do first is identify moments that matter. Now, I'm going to give you my definitions of these because there are lots of different definitions. So a moment that matters is anything that generates an emotion, one or more emotions that we can detect. Okay, so if I have to queue for a long time, I might get angry and frustrated by that. And that's detectable. That's a moment that matters. It's causing an emotional response. Now, a moment of truth, this is where many organizations focus their attention, particularly on the last thing that happens before somebody took an action. Now, that itself is made up of 2 things. There's a moment of decision, which is where I've had enough moments that matter, perhaps they're negative moments, and I've decided I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to leave. I've had enough of this. So that's my moment of decision. And there are emotions associated with that as well. And then there's the moment of action when I actually do the thing that I'm thinking about. So those are often combined. And what an organization would do is saying, well, that moment that matters caused that moment of truth to happen. And it's wrong. The problem with that is it puts too much weight on the most recent experience. And what my research showed is that actually many of the moments of truth, many of the business behaviors we're interested in are as a result of a long journey. And so what happens is that multiple moments that matter, some of them positive, some of them negative, contribute and accumulate to when people actually get to the point where they do something, and that's the customer behavior. Now, I'm trying to illustrate with this diagram one example of a moment that matters, and you can see it doesn't cause a lot of anger right at the top there. But by the time somebody leaves an organization, they may be very angry. That's one of the reasons that they leave. In fact, they're probably feeling a complex mix of emotions at that point. So there can be very many moments that matter that occur over a long time that ultimately result in somebody leaving in the business behavior that we're interested in, whether it's positive or negative. And of course, that isn't the only reason why that behavior may exist. Somebody might leave not because they're angry, but because they're afraid or disappointed in what's going on. So many moments that matter could lead to a few moments of truth or the customer experience or behavior that we're particularly interested in. And here's how I try to represent this. Now, I want you to think about this as if this was for every customer that you deal with. And I've shortened this journey down, but what we have are a whole series of things, some of which make us feel good, some of which make us feel less good. And I've also put in a couple of alert areas here that if we cross a threshold into either the red zone or the green zone, it triggers a behavior from us. So we have this customer experience, and it starts off, the customer's feeling okay-ish, a little bit better than neutral, but they're having a couple of negative experiences. Their product arrived late, or they went to buy something it wasn't in store. There can be some positives. We send them an offer. But as their relationship with us begins to degrade emotionally, they cross a point where we realize we need to do something now. This customer isn't thinking of leaving immediately, but if we carry on this path, they will. So this is the big benefit of being able to anticipate and measure empathy. We can predict earlier when somebody is going to take an action as a result of the emotions that they feel. And we can then take remedial action, so we can fix the relationship. The whole reason this came about was a customer asked me about 8 years ago, very simple question. If we do something we know our customers don't like put our prices up, can we do a better job of predicting which ones will leave? And the answer was, it depends upon how they feel. If they love you, they'll probably forgive you. But if they already hate you, this might be the final act that destroys the relationship. And your problem is not that you don't understand putting your prices up is unpopular, so you don't know how all your customers are feeling, so you don't know which ones are going to respond to that. This addresses that issue. So I want you to think of this happening for every single customer, every single day, getting an emotional score about how they feel, and then their likelihood to take an action as a result of that. And if we can predict it, we can anticipate it, and we can intervene earlier. We all know it's far harder to recover a relationship than it is to fix it early on. Now, part of the ROI calculation is, when do I act? Do I wait until they're absolutely furious, or do I act when they're a little bit irritated? Because each of those has a cost and an ROI. So this curve really represents that positive negative thing. And then we just have a sliding scale as to where I act. Many organizations act in what I call the zone of apathy. We don't really know what they want. We just assume they're not going to be emotional enough to do anything about it. And we do use empathic segments. This is where we link people not by their age and demographics, but by how they feel, because they respond differently and they contribute differently. So cohorts of customers based upon the way that they feel enables us to then design experiences for each of those. So an experience for the overlooked and neglected is completely different for one for the surprised and delighted, even though statistically they may look very similar as people. And the contribution can be huge. It's almost as powerful as knowing all of those things, like their age and their sex and gender and where they live and so on. So our models show that we can add a great deal to this. Now, this is, of course, assuming they have free choice. So if they can't buy your product, it doesn't really matter how they feel about it. But if they have free choice, if you know how they feel, you can put it into your model and get a better result. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So the business case for empathy, here's one example that New employees often can't serve customers as well as established ones. So what we do is we have to make sure that we don't just have a continuing cycle of incompetence. And many organizations, it takes a long time to get their employees to the point of competence. So what we do is we want to try and get those employees to stay longer. And that has a cost. In order to deliver empathy, we need more experienced employees. Whether this is months or weeks or years, there's a point at which they become competent, and then any additional work is negligible. So the drivers, when you're calculating ROI, this is coming back to the bottom line bit. Firstly, let's take that relationship. What does it cost to recruit, hire, retain, and motivate people as employees to deliver the experiences that customers enjoy, which drives them to be what I call actively loyal? That is not just that they're a customer for a long time, but they continue to buy. So customer lifetime value is what this is all about. And as I said, each of those has cost. And here's a worked example. So what we have is employee experience for a medium-sized organization that may add up to, let's say, 100,000 euros to hire people. This is costs you're having to cover. Obviously, we want to reduce that, but look at the customer experience numbers. If we're an average size organization and we have a lot of customers, each spending a reasonable-ish amount of money on a subscription or something, if we lose customers as a result of them being dissatisfied with the customer experience, it can have an enormous impact. And we combine these things together, it can be 10% of revenue lost immediately off the bottom line. 10% of revenue. That's an enormous number to make up in terms of profitability. So if I can reduce the costs and avoid losing those customers and having to replace them, I can have an enormous impact. So I'm happy for these slides to be shared, and if anybody would like to know more, then please do reach out. But Chrissa, let me come over to you. So I think I've left a couple of minutes for some questions, so back to you.
Peter, thank you for this insightful presentation. We have a question coming from our audience, Panayotis Sotiropoulos. Can you please elaborate what empathic segment means?
Yes, so an empathic segment is a group of customers that share similar feelings. Now, we can also give these names and profiles. You saw I did there. So, for example, the overlooked and neglected typically feel a bit sad. You know, they're the people that say, well, I've been here a long time. You never contact me unless you want something from me, and you save all the best deals for new customers. Their emotional profile is very different from somebody else. So an empathic segmentation, we typically add it to what we might call a strategic segment. You know, can this customer afford my product? Do they have a need for it? Do they match the profile? It's about the feelings. And when we add the empathic segmentation into predictive modeling, it's what gives us that boost on accuracy and the ability to tell those apart. So cohorts of customers, groups of customers defined by how they feel.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Another question that I have is, why do so few organizations measure or report the impact of empathy?
Yeah, this is, well, there are a number of reasons why this. Firstly, because they often think it's about EQ. You know, we don't need to worry about empathy. We just need to have all our employees treat customers well with emotional intelligence. And also, traditionally, it's been very hard to measure and quantify. So when you're talking to executives about this, they want hard numbers. And this all feels like it's not hard. It's actually quite soft and intangible. Now, that, of course, isn't true. As we've seen, we can actually measure the entire relationship from recruiting an employee all the way through to customers spending more. But I think also there have been many failed attempts to do it. So I think a lot of organizations said, well, we tried that 5 years ago. We couldn't work it out. We tried to measure happiness. So we gave up. We thought it was impossible. And clearly it's not. Technology has moved along a long way since then.
It's very interesting, Peter. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us at the CX Summit 2024. People know you've been with us all the previous years, and thank you for supporting the conference. Hopefully see you next year.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
See you next year, Peter. Thank you for everything.
Bye.
Bye-bye.